Chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. "Jingles," said Sarah between coughs, and she held out her arms. "He's hers. He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "Don't matter anyways. Don't make no difference, none of it." "It does matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me." And he raised his hand and slapped Bryce across the mouth, and then he turned and left the house. You ain't got no worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work with Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward, as she lined up the buttons in the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one of or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found this intrusive, clinging behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat all that up, honey. You let me hold Jingles. Give him to me. I got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off into the corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then he tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," he said. "What we're going to do is we're going to make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mommy used to hold on to her and dance her around the room." "Are you eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," and he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them up now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jingles," said Bryce. And then, moving the strings with the sticks in his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway. And the whole while at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he'd had them, he thought he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms, surely so high above the world she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jingles," said Sarah Ruth, and she held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You gotta look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with the magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too.